It's great to have you all here this evening at this launch of Sheila Jeffreys' book, Uprooting Male Domination. And the launcher is Julia Long. Now, I don't know where you're all coming from, but in Australia, we always do an acknowledgement of country at the beginning of events. So we respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their custodianship of the lands and waterways. The countries on which Spinifex offices are situated are Juru, Bunurong and Wurundjeri, Wadawurrung, Bundungara and Noongar. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. So this is the launch of Sheila's book, Uprooting Male Domination, with Julia Long launching it. And this is the 7th book of Sheila's that we have published. And if you go to the Spinifex website, we just look Spinifex Press, Sheila Jeffreys, her page with all her books will come up. So a little bit more housekeeping. If you haven't already signed up for the Spinifex newsletter, The Spin, please do so by going to the website at www.spinifexpress.com.au. And that way you'll always get information about our new books. The recording today will run for an hour. And yes, as I said before, do keep yourselves muted. I will introduce Julia and then I will introduce Sheila. Julia is a lesbian feminist and long-time activist. She's a researcher and speaker on issues including transgenderism, pornography, and men's violence against women. She organised the first ever conference dedicated to exposing the harms of transgenderism in 2016, and her particular focus has been on the crucial role played by language in embedding this ideology. Julia has worked in the field of support for women experiencing male violence in different capacities, and her professional background includes teaching, local government, academia, and the voluntary sector. Julia's PhD and subsequent published monograph examined the resurgence of feminist anti-pornography activism in the UK, and it's called Anti-Porn, the Resurgence of Anti-Pornography Feminism, was published in 2012. Julia is a regular contributor to Radical Feminist Perspective series hosted by Women's Declaration International. She also said at the end of her bio, "It's impossible to find a decent job when you are outspoken about men in dresses, and that, like many women, I have spent the last few years working in soul-crushing, tedious, low-grade, low-paid jobs." And now I will introduce Sheila, who, I mean, neither Julia nor Sheila really needs any introduction, but, you know, we do it anyway. It's for the recording, really. Sheila Jeffreys is a radical feminist activist who's worked mainly against male violence and for lesbian feminism. She joined her first women's liberation movement group in the UK in 1973 and became a lesbian in 1977. In 1991, she moved to Australia to teach at the University of Melbourne and retired back to the UK in 2015. She is the author of 12 books on issues such as the history of sexuality, lesbian feminism, prostitution, gay men's politics, beauty practices, the threat of patriarchal religion to women's rights, and the politics of transgenderism. In 2018, she published The Lesbian Revolution, Lesbian Feminism in the UK 1970 to 1990. and in 2020, her autobiography, Trigger Warning, My Lesbian Feminist Life. 2022, she wrote Penile Imperialism, the Male Sex Rights and Women's Subordination. So over to you, Julia and Sheila.
Thanks very much, Susan. So I'm going to start by introducing Sheila's wonderful new book, and then we will have a conversation about it. So it really is a huge pleasure to be introducing this book. I'll just tell you a bit about the structure of it for those who haven't seen it just yet. So the book is comprised of talks given by Sheila from 2011, but actually most of them were written in the past 5 years. And in fact, many are still available to view online. So some of them you can read and also view them online. The book opens with Sheila's acceptance speech for the richly deserved Lifetime Achievement Award that was bestowed on her by the Spanish Association of Progressive Women. And then the book is structured in four main sections: the nuts and bolts of male domination, the prostitution and reproductive technology industries, challenging gender identity politics, and lesbian feminist politics. So that's the structure of the book. So I found it a brilliant and very readable collection, and I think it's the perfect follow-up actually to Penile Imperialism, which, as Susan was saying, was also published by Spinifex in 2022. I think it's the perfect follow-up in its extensive and fearless analysis of male domination. It picks up many of the themes of that book, expanding on them and offering further insights. Sheila not only offers a meticulous analysis of well-recognized systems of oppression, such as the sex industry, but I think to misquote the famous Star Trek opener, she also boldly goes where no woman, or I think very few of us, have gone before, whether this be dissecting the horrors of nappy fetishism or diaper fetishism, you might know it as, depending on where you live. Whether it's exposing men's sexual violation of women in supposedly wholesome pursuits such as naturism, or simply noticing and analysing the significance of mundane everyday events. So, for example, in one of the early pieces, Sheila talks about the kind of expressions on the face of a young mother who's out buying her groceries, who is no doubt being bored to death by this old man who she feels obliged to sort of humour while she's out looking after her child and getting her groceries. So Sheila talks about that kind of aspect of femininity, that kind of placating through facial expressions. Or she also talks about the fact that we can't watch the evening news without, in her words, engaging in the degradation of a woman, because unless we close our eyes, we are forced to witness female newsreaders wearing debilitating high-heeled fetish shoes. And importantly, she points out that none of these things is inevitable or biologically determined, but rather socially constructed in the service of male domination and the male sex right. And I think that is a very necessary antidote to what I've noticed in the last couple of years seems to be a quite alarming and certainly retrograde tendency in sort of mainstream and we could say gender critical circles towards biological determinism. So, in noticing these things, we might say that Sheila is, another quote here, a snapper up of unconsidered trifles. She notices how deeply male domination is embedded in the ordinary and the everyday. For example, she draws our attention to the ubiquity of women's long hair hanging down like curtains, to little girls wearing skirts that restrict their physical movement, and she insists on the political significance of these things, just as second wave feminists examined every aspect of their lives through the understanding that the personal is political. And I think something that I found deeply satisfying about the book is the way in which that crucial insight of the women's liberation movement informs Sheila's analysis. So, just to finish then, I was thinking if someone asked me to say just three things that I like about the book, I think they would be these: the quality of the analysis, the writing style, and the book's authoritativeness. So I'll just say something briefly about each of those. So the quality of the analysis, I think, is exemplified in the first section, the nuts and bolts of male domination, which has chapters on equality and free speech, for example. Now, both equality and freedom of speech, I think, are generally seen in much current discourse as unproblematically sort of good things. But Sheila's analysis goes way beyond that, pointing out how equality measures fail to take account, for example, of the affirmative action programme for men that is provided by heterosexual marriage, and the fact that all social institutions and practices where women are supposed to aspire to equality are in fact created in men's image. Similarly, in talking about freedom of speech, she points out that this has historically meant very different things for men and women, that speech can be a tool used to create and enforce social inequalities, and that men use the notion of free speech to defend things like their right to pornography. And then later in the book, as I know we're going to discuss, her brilliant analysis of transgenderism as a men's sexual rights movement was years ahead, we could say light years ahead of the general gender critical understanding of the problem at the time. And I think this is all crucial analysis that we ignore at our peril. So just to say something very quickly about the writing style, because I really want to impress on anyone who hasn't yet read the book that it is an absolute pleasure to read. These pieces were written as talks on topics that I know Sheila wanted to speak about because she considered them to be urgent and pressing. And I think the writing style absolutely conveys that urgency. It's wonderfully clear. It has a vivid, direct quality, which, as I say, it's a pleasure to read, even when the subject matter is thoroughly grim. It's exhilarating and it's galvanizing. The book is never boring because it burns with truth and conviction. Finally, then, the book is authoritative because each piece is informed by Sheila's decades of experience, knowledge, and expertise. Her work provides a direct link to the women's liberation movement, to the radical feminist analysis that flourished in the 1970s and 80s. And her writing then brings that analysis to bear on all the subsequent developments right up to the present day, because she's kept thoroughly engaged with everything that's been going on, subsequently. I think Sheila's commitment to women through her radical feminist activism and scholarship has been lifelong and unwavering. And in wholeheartedly commending this book to you, I can do no better than echo the words of Leah Keith on the front of the book. If women were a nation, Sheila Jeffreys would be our Joan of Arc.
Yes, yes.
So, to bring the woman herself into the picture then. So Sheila, I wanted to ask you, in terms of just a general question about the book, I wondered how you found the process. I know your other books have been written on a specific topic, so you've had the process of actually developing your argument and your analysis over a number of chapters. So I just wondered how you found the process of putting together a collection of talks compared to how you've previously written.
Thanks very much, Julie, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. I love it. Now, the fact that you find the writing quite compelling in a way might be because I'm writing talks and I've been an academic all my life. I know I'm not very academic, I don't write boring books nobody wants to read. I'm pretty straightforward. But nonetheless, I've had to satisfy academic publishers, academic presses, journals, and so on. So I haven't been able to write in the way that I'm writing in these talks. So that it was liberating to be able to do these talks and also to be able to collect them because, it's who I really am. I think it's reasonable to say. But yes, it was new to collect talks. I've never done that. I've always written books, and often I've had one, two, or three books in my head I needed to write. I often had an urgency in writing books, and there'd be a crucial question I wanted to answer, such as, how does men's sexual fetishism or transvestism affect women? One whole book. How does male sexuality contribute to the oppression of women? Another whole book. So that's what I've done, and I've always urgently had to do that, but I don't have any urgent books in my head right now, which is, I don't know if that's good or bad, because none of those things have been solved. But what the useful thing is that I fully write talks. I'm not very confident about being off the cuff or not knowing exactly what I'm saying. So over the last 10 years, I've fully written a large number of talks, from being invited to different countries to give talks, particularly Spain, but also Germany and other countries. And also doing lots of talks for WDI. Whenever I wanted to say something urgent, like I needed to say something about free speech, I'd be able to do it for WDI, and so on and so on. So I had all these talks there, and which is amazing, really. I had thousands and thousands and thousands of words, which are, as you say, a different kind of writing for me because they're writing to do speeches. And I like doing speeches, it's fair to say. So, so that was fantastic. I was able to bring those together and suggest to Spinifex that they might kindly publish them, and they have published a lot of them, which is great. Of course, there are lots more, but these are the ones that I thought would be most interesting to my readers. So that's how it is. So it covers a large number of topics rather than just answering one question as my previous books did. So, but for that reason, I'm hoping that it will be interesting, and I'm hoping it'll be interesting to a new generation of feminists too, who are not familiar with all the different issues and don't want to read whole books or haven't got whole, time to do all that.
Mm,
But they can read, one article on equality, one on this and one on that.
mm.
So hoping it'll be useful in that way.
Yeah, I think absolutely, Sheila. And I think maybe, I mean, I do find your writing very energizing anyway, but I think maybe the fact that they are in the format of talks, that's how they were written. I think that does make them particularly dynamic, and as I was saying. And also what you were saying there, I think it really highlights the importance of Women's Declaration International and the fact that that you and Joe Brew and other women there have created that platform of the WDI talks and also the radical feminist perspectives, because it's enabled this huge body of work to be collected. And I think, as you say, I mean, everyone's very busy. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think women are still very interested to read whole books, but I think there is something about the accessibility of things on these crucial topics, which often, like when I see things written about, say, like equality or freedom of speech or some of these things, it's often a throwaway remark in, on X or on Facebook that hasn't really that shows that whoever's making that comment hasn't really thought beyond it. And I think the fact that you've written these pieces that are so, that are quite short, but actually have quite a deep analysis in such an accessible way, I think, as you say, I think is going to be very useful for women who haven't necessarily had the opportunity to think particularly deeply about them. So if we could now go on to some of the specific sections. I've already said a little bit about section one, so we thought we'd focus on the subsequent three sections. So from the second section about pornography and the sex industry, the talk that I particularly wanted you to talk about is titled "The Pornography Revolution," and I particularly like that one because it talks about the impact of pornography in I think very very its very far-reaching impact, which obviously is crucial, and I think has received certainly less attention than it should over recent years because everyone's been so caught up and under pressure to be fighting the battle about transgenderism. I have noticed there has been a bit more media attention and political attention given to this lately in the UK, at least. There was a report by Baroness Burton that came out relatively recently, so earlier this year, it was actually had really good recommendations, recommending that violent pornography be outlawed, and putting the onus on the government to regulate the industry and to make what is illegal offline to be illegal online. So it had really good recommendations, but as far as I can see, that report has been totally buried because very few women have even heard of it. It got sort of press attention on one day and then it was forgotten. There was also a report from the Children's Commissioner last week that was again, speaking with some urgency about the impact on children, but certainly nothing like addressing the far-ranging effects that you talk about in that. So I just wondered why you particularly why you wrote that, why you chose it for the collection, if you could just say a few words about it.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So this talk is one of those that I had to do because it had been in my head for some time. In fact, it had been tormenting me. Because there wasn't anything tying it all together. Porn was being approached in individual ways, like the effect on children and so on. Nobody was thinking, what is the effect on the world women live in? And that's absolutely crucially what I wanted to talk about. Now, fighting porn, it was pretty much my first feminist activism. And I was involved in the first UK anti-porn group in 1977. And back then there were only magazines. The videotapes were just becoming available, and the magazines were very tame, just photos of women's vulvas, and then women's vulvas had hair because porn models did not shave at that time. But now there's very little anti-porn activism, and the feminist critique is not well known, but I needed to say that pornography is a huge force in constructing the world women live in ways that would have been unimaginable back in the 1970s. We thought then that we could actually get it accepted that pornography was violence against women and get rid of it. Imagine that. We thought we would get rid of it. But now it's very accepted. And the only concern really is whether children see it. And there's little or no understanding that it's harmful to women, and none that all porn needs to be eliminated, just got rid of. That's all just completely gone. We're in a different world now. But now, and I needed to say, pornography is the major force in constructing woman hatred and violence against women, and it's foundational to the continuation of male domination. And I felt the need to say that porn is not just a problem for kids. I've written before how it constructs fashion, for instance. But what made me feel I had to speak out this time was seeing a couple of pieces in the media on the sexual violence that boy children had learnt from consuming pornography on their mobile phones. These boys were harassing and sexually assaulting girl children, even in primary schools, even at the age of 5. Yes, at the age of 5. And they were doing this violence against women teachers. And back in the early 80s, and in the 70s too, I was a women teacher, and other women teachers that I was working with politically at the time talked about the problem that boys would draw penises on the exercise books of girls in the classroom. That was about as bad as we thought it was. I mean, we were we were horrified by that because that was an exercise of male domination, controlling girls in the class and reminding them of male power through the penis and so on. We would be horrified by that. Now, 5-year-old girls being pulled into the toilets to be sexually assaulted is something really, really, really different. So I thought I absolutely need to talk about how far this has gone in constructing the world we live in. There weren't, of course, mobile phones then. And the pornography that boys would be likely to have seen then would be just magazines if they'd seen anything at all. And teachers then didn't have to have concerns that the boys would call them vile names and physically attack them. I mean, we never thought of that, never thought of that. It would have been unimaginable. Girls weren't being raped in the toilets and certainly not in primary school. So the cultural mores and relations between the sexes of a whole generation, I needed to say, have been transformed by pornography, and porn constructs the way men and women interact in the present. So that's why I had to do it. But I cover all sorts of other things as well, like the effect on women politicians and how difficult it is for women in many spheres now because of pornography.
Thanks, Sheila. I mean, what you were saying there about schools, that's something that I have witnessed quite recently, and I didn't really think I would be too shocked by what went on in schools, given my past, I was a teacher in the past, but really, I have to say I was really shocked. I think it was last year, when I did witness, like, one of the things that shocked me was just the kind of the language that is used by some of the really young boys, like year 7 and 8, like 11 and 12, which just showed a knowingness with some really hideous, violent pornography. And that language and vocabulary was just kind of seemed to naturally come out of their mouths. It was actually really, really disturbing, like terrible. So yeah, I think that was one of the reasons I thought that talk was so important and necessary, as you say. So we're rattling through these because we haven't got a huge amount of time. So I could I could really listen to you talk about that further, but let's move on to section 3, the section about gender identity politics. And again, I feel I was really spoilt for choice in the talks that I could have chosen for this. But for me, actually, I have to say there really was no contest. It had to be, and I think anyone who is thinking about buying this book, I think you have to get it for this chapter, this talk alone, which was the absolute classic 2018 talk on the erasure of women, which took place. I'll just say a little bit about the context and then I'll hand over to you, Sheila. Which took place at the House of Commons. It was hosted by a Conservative member of Parliament called David Davis. We always have to say it's not the Brexit David Davis, it's a different David Davis. And he very kindly offered to host the event after it was one of the wonderful events organised by the, again, equally dynamic Venice Allen, who was just a complete demon organizer, setting up all these different events. So she'd organised for this event with lesbians speaking. So it was yourself, me, and Anne Roslow were going to be speaking at this event. It was originally supposed to take place at Millwall Football Ground, which will definitely be known to UK listeners. Probably not so much outside the UK, but it was one of these events that got cancelled because the venue was totally harassed and besieged by trans activists. But the thing that was absolutely classic about us getting cancelled from that venue was the fact that Millwall is notorious or certainly in the past, it was notorious in this country for its history of football hooliganism and football violence. That, Millwall fans have been involved in some horrendous episodes of hooliganism and violence. And then Venice got this email from someone at Millwall saying, we regret we will not be able to host your event here because of the potential damage to our reputation. And it was just the most exquisite irony. So I remember I did speak about that at the beginning of the event. So anyway, it was then hosted, I have to say, a far better and more appropriate venue, the House of Commons. I had women coming up to me after that. This was a time of lots of different events happening, organised by different groups, and women coming up afterwards saying this was in a league of its own. And I think that was largely, if not wholly, down to your talk and the nature of the content juxtaposed with the kind of august venue was just absolutely perfection. So Sheila, I'll hand over to you, and maybe you could talk a bit about what you said, and then maybe a bit about the what happened afterwards. It created quite a furore.
The reaction, that's right. So, as Julia explained, the talk wasn't intended for the House of Commons. So, when I realised it was the House of Commons, I did leave out a section. I left out the section which has been put back into the published version, which was about the fish parasite, uh, Cymethia exigua, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment as well, because I think that was very interesting too. I thought, I can't go too far. I can't talk about fish parasites and transgender activism. No.
You went pretty far,
So,
Sheila.
well, no, not really. Anyway, I did, however, include sexual fetish material, and I think that upset some people. Um, it was then, as it is now, important for me to make it clear that men's gender identity problem is just a sexual perversion, right? And I think that was less well known at the time than it is now. And it was more difficult to make that point. I think more women are seeing that. You're seeing a lot of stuff about fetish and perversion and so on social media. So back then there were probably still some women who believed that men were imitating women for some other reason, some mental health problem or whatever. So what I'd done for the occasion was select some slides to show from the internet, from sort of shops where men could buy their fetish costumes, to show transvestites using lycra women's flesh suits and various lycra imitation bits of women's bodies. And one of them showed a man in a full body flesh suit fondling his breast in front of the mirror. And another showed a lycra ankle and foot sex toy with a hole in one side for penetration for the pleasure of foot fetishists. It was a woman's foot, of course. Another was of a full lower body lycra costume with a hole for penetration. They were called gaffs. A lot of these were called gaffs. Drag queens and transvestites use these things to hide their penises, and then they put holes in them so they can put the penis in and pretend it's a vagina and so on. So I used to routinely at that time show this kind of material, but it was probably not usual for such things to be shown in the House of Commons. But the interesting thing is that our host, David Davis, MP, seemed to find it all quite interesting. I was watching his face a bit, and I don't think he was offended at all. He was quite sort of urbane and okay with it all, which is amazing, really. Didn't go bananas like Pink News. So I called though in the talk, the behavior of these transvestites parasitic. And that's what created the most trouble. But I actually think they didn't like the fetish stuff either. At the time, I was angry that these men were getting positions as women's officers in local Labour Party branches and other positions where they were speaking for women. And so I said this was parasitic behavior, which seems to me quite reasonable. Parasitic's an ordinary word. We use it in ordinary speech. But they went bananas. Anyway, I compared it. I didn't at the time in that talk, but I do in this book where I put it back in, compare it to a fish parasite. And so there's this form of parasite which has parallels in its Cymethia exigua, the fish tongue-eating parasite. And the parasite severs the blood vessels in the fish's tongue, causing it to fall off. It then attaches itself to the stub of what was once the tongue and becomes the fish's new tongue, living on the fish's blood supply. I thought that was perfect, pretty perfect for what the little boys trying to be women, becoming, local Labour Party women's groups, representatives and so on. That's exactly what they were doing, and living off the women's energy, being the tongue. So but it is also a genuinely transgender parasite. And it can, unlike men, actually change sex. It's likely that what happens is the juveniles first attach to the gills of a fish and they become males. As they mature, they become females, with mating likely occurring on the gills. And if there's no female present, within a pair of two males, one male can turn into a female. And another useful aspect of the analogy, I thought, was the fact that gay male and drag community in those communities, women are called fish, a misogynistic term that apparently refers to the way that men consider that women's genitals smell. So I thought this little parasite was a great analogy in very, very many ways for what was happening in transgender politics at that time. And I think the analogy is good. But the media, particularly the gay male media, was really horrified. They didn't think I should be using the word parasite anywhere near their favoured group of male fetishists. Now, Julie, you tell me that there were some feminists who wrote a letter or were some really quite upset about this. What was that
So,
about?
yeah, absolutely. And also, so it was, I'm not quite sure how Pink News got hold of it. But anyway, there was the article in Pink News that was all absolutely making a big fuss about this transphobic speaker who had talked about so-called trans women as parasites. But as you say, I mean, I remember when you first told me, even before the talk, you told me about that parasite, and I was just struck by it. Was as though it that parasite had almost been invented to serve as an analogy, because, like you say, it just covers so many different aspects of what what men are doing. So it was a brilliant analogy. So Pink News made a big fuss about it, and it was also actually covered in Newsweek. I don't know if you saw that it was also in Newsweek as well at the time. They obviously took that from Pink News, but there were also some women from, I was going to say, not exactly from, well, from the wider, this, should we call it the gender critical movement, whatever, the sort of wider grouping. Women who were particularly involved in the Labour Party, apparently, three women, I think at least two of them, very involved in the Labour Party. And when they saw this Pink News article, they then wrote, I'm not sure if it was a letter or a piece, an opinion piece to The Guardian, basically dissociating themselves from the event and from yourself in particular and from your remarks, because they wanted to have a respectful debate and they wouldn't use this type of appalling transphobic language. So that all happened at the time. It was, I think it was particularly awful for Venice, who'd organised the event, suddenly seeing this happen. But I think in the end they actually retracted it, and it wasn't published in the end. But it just goes to show how your talk was so ahead of the game, and how others certainly frightened the horses, for all of those who were under the rather naive sort of misapprehension that it was possible to have a reasonable debate with these men. So yeah, so it was all a very lively event, and I just think
What?
it's so fantastic to have that talk in this book, because obviously we weren't allowed to record the event. You're not allowed to record
You
events.
weren't allowed to film it.
So it was one of those things that was like, it kind of went into the legends of turf events, and now it's captured in this book, which is absolutely fantastic.
I'm
Um,
pleased it's there as well, but also I think that if and you think maybe I was already rather unpopular in sort of socialist feminist circles before this, but afterwards I think they particularly thought we mustn't have anything to do with her. We can't have her
yeah,
name anywhere. I mean, she talks about sex, for goodness. She talks about men's sexual
mm,
disgusting her anywhere near,
yeah,
because it's not proper respect. It's not
yeah,
proper respect, which is you should
yeah,
never, 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 never mention any of the absolutely horrifying sexual things they say. So they, after that, I think they definitely, women
yep.
groups like WUK and now, of course, Filia, don't really think I should be near them. I'm not their kind of person.
Yep, absolutely. It was definitely shooting the messenger. And I think also, if we remember, we don't really see this so much now. We still see it a bit, but it was at the time when any sort of representative of the gender critical crowd or movement, anytime they were being interviewed on the media or putting out an article or a blog or whatever, it was almost always prefaced with we support trans rights, we're not transphobic, we support trans rights, we just want a respectful debate, all of these things. And I think you obviously completely blew that out of the water. But yeah, it did, unfortunately, for everyone who was deprived of hearing you in those contexts, it did make you a kind of a bit of an untouchable figure, which, and unfortunately, we're still seeing this, even to this day, but not here, thankfully.
Well,
So we haven't got that much time left. So let's move on to section 4. And this is the section on lesbian feminism. There's so much that we could talk about here. I think that section is kind of worth a whole section in itself. But I just wondered if you might say something about, I think it's the first talk, the first piece in this section on why men should not be in lesbian spaces, which I think that title, it's a bit like saying, why lions should not be eating omelets. It's kind of well, by the very nature of one, it's kind of obvious why it shouldn't be in the other. But obviously you wrote quite an extensive talk. So I wondered if you could explain the context of that, because obviously it was a
say a
very
little bit
specific
about
one.
that, yes, which is, I think, particularly important for the Australian listeners and interesting for them as well, of course. So the talk is a section of the statement I gave as an expert witness in the Lesbian Action Group case before the Australian Administrative Appeals Tribunal in Melbourne in early September 2024. And the case concerned the right of lesbians to meet without the presence of men who pretend to be lesbians, because the Melbourne Lesbian Action Group asked for an exemption in 2023 from the Human Rights Commission to be permitted to hold meetings at the Pride Centre in Melbourne for lesbians only. I mean, extraordinary that we should have to do that anyway. But the Commission said no. Transvestites were lesbians, just like any other lesbians, and women could not exclude them. And the decision was appealed, and I appealed online to be interrogated by the barrister for the other side in relation to the lengthy statement I provided. I had to explain in there basically what lesbians are, certainly what lesbian feminism is, what lesbian culture is, what lesbian literature is, why lesbian politics were different, how lesbians were different from gay men. All of that needed complete explanation because there's absolutely no understanding of it. And certainly, of course, no understanding on the other side of that lesbians were different in any way. And I think that was fun in a way as well, because I had to explain what autogynephilia was, basically what the perversion was to the man who was chairing the commission and so on. And so I explained to him that these men go into women's toilets and get used tampons and stuff them up their bottoms. And in particular, those who were legally associated, who were there at the time, thought this was absolutely just fantastic. I mean, you never in an ordinary court of law talk about tampons being stuffed up men's bottoms. I mean, it just doesn't happen. So that was quite fun. And of course, I do it in a very serious scientific way because, of course, I have lots of serious scientific evidence about all of it. It's just that nobody ever talks about that sort of things. So, so I had to explain that these men had a sexual perversion, and I had to explain why they persecuted and harassed lesbians because they wanted to sexually use lesbians. Lesbians were the women who wouldn't have anything to do with men, so the men were desperate to get their penises into lesbians. It was a matter of, a huge importance to them. And I explained in there that back in 1962, the first lesbian group that was set up in the UK, the Minorities Research Group, report in their newsletter at that time that they were astonished that men were phoning up their helpline. I mean, why? Because there was no knowledge then at all. Lesbians had no knowledge of men's perversions and the idea that they would do that. But the fact is, men have always wanted to get their penises into lesbians and to harass lesbians, let alone pretend they're lesbians. That's a wonderful coup of the present moment, that the legal system has justified men actually pretending to be lesbians. I mean, how absolutely marvelous for them. But for decades and decades, they've been sexually excited by trying to use lesbians, pretending to be lesbians, and so on. So I had to explain all of that and like how they're now trying to get onto apps and into lesbian spaces and to anywhere they can. And I was trying to explain how, for instance, having described what lesbian culture was in the original statement, I tried to explain how if these men were coming into lesbian spaces, you couldn't have lesbian culture. For instance, if lesbians wanted to have a discussion of lesbian love poetry and a reading, which is perfectly reasonable to do, um, they couldn't possibly do that if there were men pretending to be lesbians and dressed in ridiculous clothing all over the room, getting sexually excited and having erections at the very idea that lesbians should do anything with each other at all. I mean, obviously, you can't have lesbian culture if you have these men in there just to get off on the very idea that it could exist, right? So it was hard to do that witness statement, and it was very lengthy and very hard to do because there was very little. These days, there's very, very little because we've lost everything in the backlash against feminism, and now with these men demanding to be in everything, so difficult to have any culture, community, literature, meetings, politics, anything. And there's nothing written really these days. It's almost nothing. So I had to sort of make up some whole cloth out of nothing at all, really. I mean,
Yeah.
and it was very difficult. I got a kind of lockjaw trying to do it. I had to go to the doctor because I was in such terrible pain trying to do
Oh
these things because I knew how
gosh.
important it is. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, we lost. After all that, we
Yeah.
lost. I think there is going to be an appeal, but that was extremely distressing. I mean, there in the other case that's just happened in Australia, the Tickle versus Kegel case, which finished quite recently, where this man um, has been trying to get into a women's app, and he was denied, and he then sued the woman running the app, and she was told she had to pay all this money and so on. So she then appealed against that. That case is finished. But they've used the Lesbian Action Group case, I know, and they've used the Supreme Court decision in Britain, which of course is very different, fortunately. And that decision will come down in a few months' time. So we may find out whether lesbians will, at some point in the future, be able to to meet and do things without their overseers' presence, without their sexual fetishist overseers present and in the room. I mean, kind of important. And nobody could have imagined back in the days of women's liberation movement and feminism that we would never even be allowed to meet without the guards.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
that's what we're waiting on at the moment.
Yeah,
And I think that's what you have
and
to say
we
about
should
that.
just say, I know we're going to have to hand over. We haven't got that much time left, but just to say that the rest of that section, you do certainly revisit some of these topics like lesbian ethics and some of the other topics that you do expand on, which I think gives a kind of a suggestion of what had been, a kind of fairly normal, commonplace part of lesbian feminist culture and lesbian culture, which was sort of discussion of ethics and philosophy alongside all the kind of social, cultural, community aspects. So there are those. But as you say, the fact that we've been caught up for the last sort of 10 years or so it feels like we've literally been trying to walk and someone keeps tying our shoelaces together and then we have to stop and untie them every time and then take another step, and it just feels like that we're constantly being set back by having to explain what are in fact totally obvious things, that as soon as a man is in a lesbian space it's no longer a lesbian space, and that's it. But yeah, thank you, Sheila. That was wonderful to hear a bit of background to all of those talks. I think was it Susan? Were you going to say if there were any questions
Um,
in the chat for Sheila, and then we'll hand over to Renata to close.
I've been watching the chat. Most of the questions are about is this recorded? Yes, it'll be on our YouTube channel tomorrow morning. And the book is available in a number of different places depending on where you are. In the UK, you can go to Gazelle, and I know Amazon has copies, but like whatever. In the US, we have a distributor there, or you can get copies directly from the Spinifex website, whether it's a print book or an ebook. And because our dollar is quite cheap in terms of pounds, it doesn't work out very different in the price. Grace O'Malley made the comment to you, Julia, sock femmes, and then you brought up sock femmes. So that's all that's really been in the chat. So now Renata can come on board and do her bit.
Yes, is Renata hearable?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Julia and Sheila, for your very spirited remarks. I must say, when Sheila asked me if we were interested in a collection of her talks, I immediately said, yes, 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 because not only do I agree with Sheila, that is always really useful when you edit a book, but I really think that what Sheila has done in this book is particularly important because we all know that the attention span of our young ones and our own, I suppose, is not as what it used to be. And these are short essays mostly. And I can really see young women getting together in a what we would have called consciousness raising group and reading these essays and comparing them to what they see around them in their lives and whatever. And it could really be, I'm always an eternal optimist, this could really be the start of a new revolution. So I really, 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 from the bottom of my heart, want to thank Sheila for doing another book with us. It's always really good and easy to do a book with Sheila because she doesn't need a lot of editing. She's well written, she's organized. I think we did manage to lose a few chapters, but never mind, they got found again. And together with Pauline Hobson, I mostly edited these talks, and it was really, really very nice to do. I was also particularly pleased that, Sheila, that you included a talk on surrogacy, because this is not a topic that you normally talk about. And all I could say is the more the better. That's a really good talk, and you actually introduce a few new concepts like the concept of concubinage, which please do read that chapter. So all in all, it's a fabulous book. I hope it will go far and wide. It will be read by young women. It also happens to have a fantastic cover. And once Sheila said, oh, I love orange, we were all set on this great cover. So that leads me into thanking everybody who's a member of this a team Spinifex, because these books don't just, I mean, we get a manuscript, we edit it, but it's not a book. So I thank very much Susan. Of course, without Susan, nothing would happen at Spinifex. Danielle, who sends the books out and keeps us all ticking over. Rachel, who you saw before, who is our tech guru, but she's also our publicist and does wonders with some of the publicity. And there has been a bit of interest, Sheila, in your book, but you never know how far it goes. And Caitlin Roper, who is our social media person, and will be spruiking your book on X and Instagram, and I don't know if we're in TikTok these days. I am not on TikTok. I'm far too old for TikTok, but you know, I think Caitlin isn't. So we're a very good team, and we are very, very delighted to actually really have this new book by Sheila. I also just want to say that Julia was a fantastic launcher at the Philia conference a couple of years ago of penile imperialism, despite, very, very big saying, no, she's not to launch it. And she did, because we just invited her up and she did a fabulous launch. So unfortunately, though, this year we had not had such luck. Philia excluded Sheila from the two Spinifex panels that we will actually have. There at the Philia at the Sunday, we have the time now at 11 for 90 minutes for Sue's panel, and then at 2 o'clock for my panel for 90 minutes. We are extremely sorry that Sheila will not be part of it. We talked until we were blue in the face, but they blamed Sheila for having said rude things. about philia. Another book that we recently published and had a launch on, which is Fiona McAnina, who I think is actually here. Her book Turf Island, and that book was also banned because not of Fiona, because Fiona is actually talking on sex matters, but because of the fact that, oh no, she has a chapter on Kelly J. Keane in the book, and Kelly J. Keane sadly is demonized by so many so-called gender critical feminists who should really know better. Even if you don't like Kelly J. Keane, it is part of history, and we should always respect history and look at it and listen to it. However, not to be beaten ever, which we're not because we're radical lesbian feminists, we will have a side event, and it is on the 10th of October in an undisclosed location in the center of Brisbane. It's only about 5 to 10 minutes walk from the undisclosed philia location. If you want to come there, but you have to be at, in Brighton at the time. The flyer at the moment is available from Sheila's Facebook page, not the Rose Jordan, but the actual Sheila Jeffreys Facebook page. We will eventually put it also on the Spinifex page. And we have already a lot of takers, and it should be a very jolly event. Julia Long will do another in conversation with Sheila. And also we have Joe Bartosz, who has also an interesting book out called Pornography, and she will talk about that together with Leah Keys. So it should be a very, very nice event. Could you hold up? So yeah, that is the flyer, excluded but not silenced. But as I said, at the moment, it's the best thing you can do is to go to Sheila Jeffreys Facebook, and you have to log in there and get a ticket. It's free, but no, it's not free actually. It costs $12, £12.
But there is food.
Some food there. Yeah. So I think you have probably said enough, apart from, again, really thanking Sheila that her so remarkable essays, and often you were really truly the first to talk about it. I mean, I just think of Gender Hurts, for instance. You wrote that book when hardly anybody even was talking about it or taking it seriously or really understood what this whole gender cult was about. And you wrote that book, so thank you for that. And really, this collection, Uprooting Male Domination, is a fabulous collection. So please get it. Please recommend it to your friends, the young ones. They have to read it. It's really not that long. They can, concentrate. And we see you all there, and we do it all again in Brighton in October. So thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Danielle. I think Pauline is not there, but not sure about Caitlin. And thanks for all your very hard work, and especially thank you to Julia, and even more especially, thank you very much for Sheila. And we need to think about what your next book is. You said you didn't have any ideas. There has to be something, Sheila, that you are very keen about.
We'll
We
think
find
about it.
something.
But can I also say, thanks
have
very
the
much.
revolution.
To Spinifex and WDI and Julia, and we are we're a whole new team getting the word out there, even despite all those who don't want us to do so.
Absolutely.
So thanks
We are never beat.
so
So have a nice day, or in Australia, have a nice evening, and drink to the success of Sheila's new book, and to Julia and to all of us, and buy the book. Very important, so that Spinifex can survive, because we need to survive. So,
and
all
I'm
right.
just going to speak now so that my face comes up a bit bigger, I hope, so you can see the flyer a bit more easily. So it's got the cover of the book and a picture of Sheila, which is the same picture that is on Trigger Warning. So that's how it looks. Okay, and I hope we'll see some of you at Philia and at the book launch. Thank you.
Bye-bye.